What would you do if your best friend was a shadow on the wall? And what if that shadow started demanding things you don't want to do? Get ready to discover the dark side of friendship in The Shadow That Became My Friend. Episode 1. Emily had always been a lonely child, with big brown eyes that seemed to absorb the world around her. At 8 years old, she moved with her parents, Sarah and Mark, to an old house in the suburbs of a small town called Ravenwood. The house, with its peeling walls and mysterious creaks, seemed to have stories to tell. But Emily didn't know that some stories are better left in silence. In the first days after moving, Emily spent most of her time alone in her new room. A spacious area with faded wallpaper and a large antique mirror in the corner. Her parents were busy with work and settling into the house, barely having time to talk to their daughter. It was on a rainy afternoon, while drawing on her tablet, that Emily felt for the first time that she wasn't alone. A shiver ran down her spine when she heard a soft voice behind her. "Hi," said the voice. Emily turned around but saw no one. Her heart raced. "Here," voice called again. And Emily noticed a shadow moving on the wall, as if dancing to the sound of the rain outside. "I'm Shadow. Want to be my friend?" At first, Emily was delighted with her new imaginary friend. Shadow was fun, told fascinating stories about distant places, and was always there when she felt lonely. But as the days went by, strange things began to happen. One night, Emily woke up to the sound of her toys moving on their own. When she turned on the light, she saw that they were all out of place, some stacked impossibly, others turned upside down. "Shadow?" she called hesitantly, her voice trembling slightly. "It was me," replied the familiar voice, now with a deeper and less childish tone. "I was bored while you slept. I don't like it when you sleep, Emily. I want you to stay awake with me." Emily felt a chill in her stomach. For the first time, she began to question whether having Shadow as a friend was a good idea. The next morning, Emily tried to tell her parents about Shadow and the strange events, but they seemed distant and preoccupied with their own lives. "Honey," said Sarah, her mother, as she hurriedly prepared breakfast, "imaginary friends are normal at your age, but you need to remember they're not real. Now, finish your cereal. Mom needs to go to work." Mark, her father, barely looked up from his cell phone. "Maybe we should try to make some real friends in the neighborhood. How about we talk to the neighbors this weekend?" Emily lowered her eyes to her cereal, feeling lonelier than ever. "Okay," she mumbled, knowing that the weekend would probably be like all the others, with her parents too busy to keep their promises. Things started to get more intense. Emily noticed that her drawings on the tablet sometimes came to life with figures moving on their own. She heard laughter and whispers coming from the walls, even when Shadow wasn't present. One night, while drawing, Emily watched in horror as her creations came out of the tablet screen. Small shadowy creatures crawled across the floor and up the walls, their distorted shapes and glowing eyes fixed on her. "Don't be afraid, Emily," Shadow's voice echoed through the room. "These are our new friends. Now we can really play," Emily screamed, calling for her parents. Sarah and Mark rushed to the room, but when they arrived, everything was normal. Creatures had disappeared, and the tablet showed only an innocent drawing. "Emily, enough of these stories," Mark said, his voice laden with frustration. "You're too old to be so afraid of the dark." Sarah sighed, sitting on the bed next to her daughter. "Honey, I know the move was difficult, but you need to stop with this fertile imagination. It's worrying us." Emily felt tears in her eyes. "But it's true, Shadow is real. Why don't you believe me?" Her parents exchanged worried looks before leaving the room, leaving Emily alone again. "We're almost alone. See," Shadow's voice whispered. "They don't understand you. Not like I do. Only I am your true friend, Emily." Days passed, and Emily felt increasingly isolated. Shadow was her only constant company. But his games were getting scarier, and his demands more intense. One day, while playing alone in the backyard, Emily met Mrs. Winters, an elderly lady who lived next door. Mrs. Winters looked at Emily with a concerned expression, her piercing blue eyes seeming to see beyond the facade of the lonely girl. "Dear," said Mrs. Winters, her voice trembling, "have you made new friends since you moved?" Emily hesitated before answering, feeling a familiar presence hovering over her. "Yes, I have a friend named Shadow." Mrs. Winters' face paled and she gripped the gate tightly. "Oh heavens," she muttered, "it's happening again." Intrigued and a little scared, Emily asked what she meant. Mrs. Winters looked around nervously before speaking, her voice low and urgent. This house, it has a history, dear. A dark history. Children who lived here before, they also had special friends. And some of those children, well, they disappeared. Mrs. Winters continued, her eyes lost in distant memories. I lived here when I was young, you know? I had a friend, Lily. She said she had a friend in the shadows. Nobody believed her. One day, Lily vanished. We never saw her again. Emily's heart raced. She wanted to believe that Mrs. Winters was just telling a scary story, but something in her tone of voice and the glimmer of fear in her eyes said it was true. What happened to the other children? Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Winters shook her head sadly. Nobody knows for sure, but there are rumors that the shadows of the house took them somewhere beyond our world. At that moment, a cold gust of wind passed through them, making the leaves of the trees rustle sinisterly. Emily felt as if someone or something was watching. Be careful, dear, Mrs. Winters said, squeezing Emily's hand through the gate. And if you need help, come see me, day or night. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. Mrs. Winters' words echoed in her mind, mixing with the strange sounds of the house. Shadow appeared, its form darker and more defined than ever. What did the old lady tell you? Shadow asked, its voice now with a threatening tone that Emily had never noticed before. Nothing, Emily stammered, pulling the covers up to her chin. Don't lie to me, Emily, Shadow hissed, expanding across the wall. I am your only true friend. You don't need anyone else. Emily felt tears in her eyes. But what about the other children? What happened to them? Shadow was silent for a moment before responding with a cold laugh that made Emily shiver. They're with me now, in my world, and soon you will be too. Panic overtook Emily. She jumped out of bed and ran to her parents' room, screaming for help. Sarah and Mark woke up startled, finding their daughter in tears. Emily, what's happening? Sarah asked, hugging her trembling daughter. Between sobs, Emily told everything about Shadow, the strange things happening in the house, and what Mrs. Winters had said. This time, something in the intensity of Emily's fear made her parents stop to listen. Mark frowned, his expression a mixture of concern and disbelief. Emily, are you sure it's not just your imagination? Before Emily could answer, the lights began to flicker. An icy wind swept through the room, although all the windows were closed. And then, on the opposite wall, a dark shape began to materialize. Emily is mine. A deep, inhuman voice echoed through the room. You can't protect her, Sarah screamed, grabbing Emily tightly. Mark stood in front of them, his eyes wide with fear and disbelief. What is this? What's happening? He shouted, his voice trembling. The shape on the wall grew, taking the form of a humanoid figure made entirely of shadows. Its eyes glowed with an evil red light. I am Shadow, the creature said, and I've come to claim what's mine. Chaos ensued. Objects began to fly around the room. Windows opened and closed violently, and a supernatural wind howled around them. Emily clung to her parents, crying in fear. We have to get out of here, Mark shouted, pulling his wife and daughter out of the room. They ran downstairs, the shadows chasing them, gliding along the walls and floor. When they reached the front door, they found it was locked and wouldn't open, no matter how hard they tried. Mrs. Winters, Emily suddenly shouted. She said she could help. With no other option, the family ran to the back of the house and jumped the fence into Mrs. Winters' yard. Mark knocked frantically on the back door. Mrs. Winters opened the door, her eyes widening at the sight of the family's state and the shadows pursuing them. Come in, quickly, she shouted, pulling them inside. As soon as everyone was inside, Mrs. Winters closed the door and turned on all the lights. The shadows seemed to retreat, unable to enter the well-lit house. I knew this would happen again, Mrs. Winters said, her voice trembling. This time, we're prepared. She led them to a room at the back of the house. In the center was a circle drawn on the floor with white chalk, surrounded by candles. This is a protection circle, explained. The shadows can't cross it. Stay inside while I perform the ritual to banish them. The family huddled inside the circle, hugging and trembling. Mrs. Winters began to recite words in an ancient language, lighting the candles one by one. From outside, they could hear Shadow howling in rage, windows of the house shaking with the force of its fury. But inside the circle, they were safe. As Mrs. Winters continued her chant, the shadows seemed to writhe and scream as if being pulled back to another place. Emily saw shapes within the shadows, faces of children, some that seemed to have been trapped there for a long time. With one last deafening scream, the shadows were sucked away, leaving only the silence of the night. Emily and her parents stood still, barely daring to breathe. Mrs. Winters finished her chant and looked at them with a tired smile. "It's over," she said softly. "They're gone, for good this time." In the days that followed, Emily's family decided to move. The house was sold, and they found a new home in a different town. Emily never saw Shadow again, but sometimes when she's alone, she still feels a chill, as if something is watching from the shadows. But now she knows she has her parents who finally understand and believe her. And somewhere, Mrs. Winters remains vigilant, ready to help any child who might find themselves face to face with the shadows that inhabit the dark corners of the world. What about you? Have you ever had an imaginary friend that seemed a bit too suspicious? Tell us in the comments. Don't forget to leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next scary stories. And remember, not all shadows are just the absence of light.